She specialises in trade policy globally and from a UK and EU perspective. She advises FTSE 100 and Fortune 500 businesses, privately owned companies and trade associations. Speaking second on my far right is Shanker Singham, the Chief Executive Officer of Competere Limited. He is a trade fellow at the Institute of Economic Affairs, was previously our director of the International Trade and Competition Unit, and was the author of our document Plan A+, which ended up being the accepted roadmap to get Brexit done. He's worked on the privatisation of the UK electricity market, the transition of Soviet Central and Eastern European economies, and the accession of Poland and Hungary to the EU, and the World Trade Organization accessions of a number of countries, including China and Russia. On my immediate right is Anishka, Jelicich. Have I done that just about okay? No, acceptable. She leads the government and industry relations team for Pernod Ricard's 3 UK-based entities, Chivas Brothers, Global Travel Retail and Pernod Ricard UK. She joined Pernod in 2010. She has served as an advisor in the New Zealand Parliament to 2 government ministers and worked for the New Zealand Treasury and New Zealand Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Joining us very shortly in this chair is Connor Burns, the Right Honourable Connor Burns, our Minister of State for Trade Policy. He was elected to the House of Commons in 2010 and was appointed Minister of State at the Department for International Trade on the accession of the new government just last month. So please join me, even though in Connor's absence, to give a very warm welcome to our panellists. So let me, perfectly timed, Connor, to enter just as the round of applause bursts out. So let me just introduce the topic. We've called this session International Trade in Uncertain Times, and they truly are turbulent times for international trade. Global supply chain issues and rising geopolitical tensions really offer truly seismic challenges. How can the UK navigate these uncertain times? What opportunities can we utilise, and how can we get trade going again? Sally, I'm going to ask you to kick off.
Can I check everyone can hear me at the back? Excellent, that's always good to know. So it's lovely to see so many of you here today to talk about trade. And when we're talking about trade in uncertain times, these really are turbulent for trade. But this is a trend that has been ongoing since 2007, 2008. And that turbulence, which started in the trade world from 2007 and 2008, has seen an enormous rise in protectionist measures that have outstripped liberalising measures over the past decade by a factor of 7 to 1. That's made even harder for the trade community because it comes off 7 decades following World War II, when the global consensus was towards lowering trade barriers rather than rising them. So we have a whole bunch of businesses and indeed governments who'd got used to a world of liberalisation that simply doesn't exist anymore. So those rising protectionist measures are, if anything, accelerating. The global financial crisis was just the start. There's no sign that those trade barriers are going to start falling as a matter of course anytime soon around the globe. So I come at this from very much a business perspective. What do we do in uncertain times? We make our own certainty. And I think that there are 3 or 4 different ways that that applies in a trade context. And although I'm coming at it from a business perspective, they apply to governments just as much as they apply to corporates. So the first thing that you have to do is you have to be scanning the horizon, not just looking at what's coming at you in the immediate future. And one of the problems we find, again, because people haven't had to think about trade in these terms for a very long time, is that there aren't that many people out there who are very good at recognising the triggers and the sources of information that tell you when problems might be coming down the line. So my advice to policy advisors, to governments, to corporates is to work out which sources you trust and what triggers are likely to suggest that something is coming down the line that you need to know about, and then have a rigorous and absolutely disciplined focus on managing those. Now, different companies and different organisations will have different sources that they trust and different triggers. One of the things we find most helpful is to review things like social media and academic publications, which is difficult and time-consuming, but nevertheless is really important because those often give the canary in the mine warning that something is coming way ahead of publications on Europa, for example. So work out what your triggers are, be very disciplined in following them, make sure you've got the ear of the right people at an early enough occasion so that if you do sound an alarm, it will be listened to. And don't forget that sometimes those early warning signals will be for opportunities as well as for risks, and be ready and aware to take advantage of those when you can. So horizon scanning is tip number 1. Tip number 2 is to bake more transparency into your operations. And again, this tip is as important for governments as it is for businesses. And I think digital trade, a subject I heard Connor speak on this morning, is going to be a really important part of that. If I were to pick one government around the world which is better at digital trade than any other, it would be Singapore. Now, it is easy to be good at digital trade when you're a dictatorial city-state with only one port, granted, but it's worth remembering that the main trigger to get Singapore ahead of the trade curve came not from the ports, not from the goods companies, but from the banks, who wanted to better understand their insurance positions and their export finance positions and needed additional transparency, which they achieved through digital trade in order to better understand where the risks are. Now, that transparency doesn't just come from a finance perspective. It tells you where your goods are. It tells you where the blockages are. It tells you if you've got stuff hanging around outside ports. It tells you if your just-in-time processes are working. It tells you if your borders are an issue. Now, how do you bake transparency? And the UK government is going really, really big guns at digitalising its borders. I'm not going to go much further because we've got Shanker Singham here, who's something of an expert on that area, but do keep an eye on what the UK government is doing. Do respond to consultations because they matter. Do make sure that you're looking at the consultation responses when they're published, because digital trade is a big way forward. Third tip, and this is a third one, I picked these, by the way, very deliberately to apply to government as well as organisations, business organisations, is around efficiency. And by some margin, the least efficient part of trade at the moment is the human element. And that's because we don't have that many people in this country or around the world who are good at trade. EY did a survey last summer. We asked 400 trade professionals where they saw their biggest risk, and not one of the 400 cited recruitment of expertise in trade as being easy. In fact, only 5 out of the 400 cited it as being moderately difficult. Everybody else said, we can't recruit trade people and we need to. So if you've got good trade people, hang on to them like grim death. Do not let them go because they are valuable and you can't easily replace them. There are some really good training courses out there. The universities do a really good job around a lot of that, and they do it really quite well priced. So get your people trained up to understand what they need to look for. And if you do those 3 things, if you horizon scan, if you look for transparency, and if you bake in more efficiency into your trade functions, you're going to be able to manage the uncertain times. Thank you.
Sally, thank you very much, and sticking pretty much to time. Shanker, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark, and it's a real pleasure to be here again at the IEA. I'm going to focus on trade policy, and I'll sort of jump off from Sally's comment about the regulatory barriers and trade barriers, protectionism essentially rising over the last few years, and that's absolutely right. The problem is that if you look at this in terms of, if we start at the multilateral level, there's very little in the tank in the multilateral level. We've not had a really big concluded agreement, and you kind of have to have these on a regular basis, and we haven't had a big one for really since the Uruguay round. So you're talking about a good third of the lifetime of the GATT WTO system without a concluded round. And when you don't do that, that's when these sort of regulatory barriers and protectionism just sort of starts to rise. There's a couple of things I would focus on multilaterally. There is a EU-Japan-US agreement on market distortions, or a body of work on market distortions. That has a big impact on China distortions. Obviously, that's the target for it. But it's not, the ambition, the initial ambition has been, considerably attenuated. The domestic regulation work in the WTO is going relatively well, and that does deal with some, not all, but some of the sort of regulatory barriers that we're seeing around the world. But it's fairly high level, fairly sort of superficial. Customs facilitation, Sally mentioned again, digital trade, that these are the sorts of things that you need to do in customs facilitation. And customs facilitation is relatively, it's easier to do in a way because you're just trying to make these processes work better. When you're trying to deal with a tariff or regulatory barrier or some sort of protectionism, it's there because some very powerful interest has put it there. So it's obviously very difficult to remove it. So there's a lot of activity in the facilitation space, largely because there's not much else that can be done. Plurilaterally, the big ones are the TPP, the CPTPP. There's also the US has its Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, but that is a very, that's a relatively minor, it's a big program, but it doesn't involve any market access. So think about what the US is saying to countries in the Indo-Pacific. You must satisfy our environmental and labor provisions, but we're not going to give you any market access. So, that's going to be a long road. And bilaterally, obviously from a UK perspective, we've got a number of agreements, Australia, New Zealand, that we've done. The India deal is moving forward. There is an opportunity, I think, with India that the US and EU have been negotiating with India. India is notoriously difficult to do a deal with, but I think there is an opening there if the UK is open on what's called Mode 4 services, which is movement of natural persons. So it's not immigration, it's business visas, it's that kind of thing, it's mobility agreements. But we will have to do that if we want to get a deal with India that involves, and in deference to Pernod Ricard, I should mention the Scotch whisky tariff in India, which needs to come down, tax needs to come down, and legal services access, financial services access. China is the big sort of elephant in the room whenever we have these discussions. Obviously, China distorts its market in significant ways, and that has a huge impact on global trade. We are trying in the sort of, I guess, multilateral system, and also between the US and the UK, to come up with ways of dealing with China distortions, to lower, to essentially find ways of offensively trying to get countries to lower their distortions, but also defensively, what do you do if you're adversely affected by a China SOE, for example, that is able to price at very low levels in either the UK or international markets? How can you combat that if you are sort of a normal private firm? And that is a very big issue. Unfortunately, I think there's quite a lot going on, and Sally mentioned horizon scanning. There's quite a lot going on that is taking us in the wrong direction. So things like, if you look at the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, there's a lot of Buy America provisions in there. If you look at the CBAM proposals from the European Union on climate change tariffs, effectively, there is a move generally. It's a sort of fundamental WTO principle that you do not discriminate based on the way a product is produced. You actually focus more on the product itself, and you don't discriminate in terms of how it's produced. Well, obviously, climate change is changing that dynamic, and CBAM and other proposals will erect tariff barriers and barriers to trade. This is not that we must, we obviously have to do something about the issue, and we have to mitigate in some ways. But there are ways of doing that are less damaging to international trade flows. And the UK will be thinking about what it does in terms of its approach to climate change and trade. There's a discussion in the WTO about this, but certainly that is one to watch, because that could have an immediate cost rising effect depending on the sector that you're in. So those are the sort of trade deals. And I should have mentioned also that in the UK context, the UK GCC trade deal is also a very important one. I didn't mention the UK. The UK has actually quite a lot going on with the US in terms of memorandum of understanding and so on with the states. And this is important because there's a lot of regulation that the US does at a state level. There's a lot of government procurement the US does at a state and municipal level. So it does matter if you can get some of this stuff in place. And so the final thing I would say is market access barriers. As was mentioned, trade deals are not the only way of solving market access barriers. You can solve them also individually by country to country negotiations, and that agenda needs to be carried forward and is being carried forward. If you want to know about the barriers, there's the European Trade Barrier Regulation, there's the US National Trade Estimate, and the UK now is doing something similar. To inventory foreign country trade barriers around the world, and knowing what the environment is the first step to solving the problems.
Shanker, thank you. I only need to fine you marginally for running a few seconds over time. Anishka, the floor is yours, although I need to start by offering an apology. My most important duty at the start of this meeting was to thank Pernod enormously for sponsoring this event. It's only thanks to your generosity that we can, and others like you, that we can run Think Tank at all. So thanks for being here, and thanks also for your generous sponsorship. And the floor is yours. I'll give you an extra minute or two if you really want.
Thank you, Mark. We think these conversations are important. That's why we engage in them as a firm. Pernod Ricard is the #2 wines and spirits company in the world. And so therefore we are a case study in the costs and benefits of trade. From the UK, about a third of our strategic brands are produced here, from Orkney down to Plymouth. We have 2,000 staff across the UK, and we export about £1 billion of whiskey and gin to over 160 markets worldwide, everywhere from Albania to Zambia. So we certainly know the ins and outs of trade. Trade is what enables us to invest more, to grow our brands. Over 90% of what we make is exported. And on the back of that exports, we've been able to invest in making our distilleries carbon neutral to offer more jobs in Scotland. So we see the benefits of having a more confident and agile trade policy. It's no secret, as they've said, that trade has been uncertain for a while and has been becoming increasingly more so. And we have faced as a company everything from COVID with the shutdowns in different markets across the world, the supply chain issues, the energy crisis, rebalancing tariffs, not to mention the usual sort of high tariffs and non-tariff trade barriers. Despite this, we managed to deliver record growth last year. And that's thanks to our diversified markets, that's thanks to our staff, and that's thanks to some very good planning. But just imagine what we could do with a better, faster trade framework. And I'd like to pick up on something, Kemi Badenoch, the Secretary of State, likes to talk about the trade motorway. Well, I think that in some countries we are definitely on the B road, while our competitors or the local industry are zipping along on the highway. Other countries we're trying to get on the slip road. And a lot of the time at the moment we feel like Super Mario Brothers. People are just throwing hazards in our way. So what we want to do is get those hazards out. One of the things is by building more motorways, to use the Secretary's analogy. So we're very grateful. As an Antipodean, the Australia-New Zealand FTA will deliver real benefits for our sector and for the British consumers. So we will be able to export more of our Scotch whisky and gin, and British consumers will be able to enjoy more Jacobs Creek and Brancott Estate wines here. And that should deliver about $41 million of growth for the entire UK spirits industry. Shanker was kind enough to reference the India FTA and the unfortunate 150% tariffs that we currently enjoy in the market. We are definitely looking towards a good and strong outcome in the Indian FTA. I hasten to say not like the Australian FTA, which was shallow. It liberalised precisely 2% of Australian wines into India. That's not what we'd like to see for Scotch. So the important thing is to make sure that we get the thresholds right as the government enters the end game. We also have been buffeted, and to go to Sally's point about horizon scanning, we didn't realise that we'd have to pay so much attention to electric car vehicles or steel or Airbus, large civil aircrafts, but we were subject to tariffs under the Airbus Boeing, and we're pleased to see the resolution of those disputes. And we know the government worked very hard to remove them, but while they remain hanging in abeyance, they are a threat to the industry. And we saw India last week notify the WTO of its intention to put tariffs on a range of UK products, including Scotch whisky, to rebalance some of the costs that it has endured from the extension of the UK steel tariffs. So this is still very much a mobile field. We are keeping our head to the ground. We are grateful for the UK government efforts. We also want to scale up markets. So CPTPP is an important milestone for companies like ours, as much for regulatory coherence and access for a common trading platform as it is for the markets that it will open, such as Malaysia. But the bread and butter is the market access. It's removing the customs blockages that allow illicit trade to be 1 in 4 bottles globally. It's removing the extra paperwork that we face into some markets, the strip stamps that can only be applied in Scotland and then imported through one place. Those kinds of things are the day-to-day work that keeps our company very busy. And also, there's an opportunity to work with other countries, because not every country is going to give us a free trade deal, but we can work with them bilaterally on standards. So we're really keen on high standards in whisky with China, which will set the benchmark for our industry and their local industry and aspirations. So going forward, it remains challenging, but the opportunities to grow are there and significant. We are cautiously optimistic that with the right trade policy framework and the right focus on market access barriers, the British industry can continue to go forward.
Anishka, thank you very much. Connor, welcome, congratulations on your recent ministerial appointment. What's the UK government take on this? We've said how turbulent the times are, that it hasn't been a particularly great era for growth in trade. What's your plan and what's your strategy to navigate this turbulence and to get trade growing again?
Well, Mark, thank you, and thank you all for being here. Look, there's not a lot of good news around at the moment, is there? And I think passionately that the Department for International Trade is going to be the one department of government that will be the heralder of good news. We have 3 sort of priorities in the department. So I have returned to international trade. Boris gave me this same role that I'm doing now back in July 2019, and I'm very pleased that the new Prime Minister has asked me to return to it. I served under her when she was Trade Secretary. And by the way, despite some stuff that's been reported today, slight misinterpretation of something I said, she has my 100% full-throttled support. I was making an observation this morning that trade agreements need to be more than Instagram posts. And I was making the point that unless you actually proactively get support to British businesses in the regions, in the nations of the UK, to exploit the opportunities that free trade agreements create, that eliminating market access barriers create, you might as well not bother. A trade agreement in and of itself doesn't do anything other than create a news story. It is what you do with the opportunities, the freeing up, the unblocking of the arteries of trade that the trade agreements and the market access programs do that are the opportunity. And it is that is absolutely 100% aligned to the Prime Minister's ambition to grow the UK economy, to not just talk about redistribution of the cake, but having a bigger cake to allocate. And I'm very excited by the opportunities that present themselves. And I'm also, by the way, hugely energized to be working under Kemi Badenoch, who I think will re-energize the Department for International Trade and refocus it on the missing bit. I always argue that we should rename the Department for International Trade the Department for International Trade and Export Promotion. Members of Parliament across the country have jobs fairs. They organise jobs fairs. I would like every Member of Parliament to be an export champion in their own constituencies. I would like them to use one of the few powers that MPs have, which is the power to convene, to use the office to bring together local enterprise partnerships, councils, local chambers of commerce, to show businesses in communities, in constituencies, across the country, the tools that are available to them to help them access the benefits that the free trade agreements create. So there's three bits of the work that the Department for International Trade do. One is the negotiation of the free trade agreements. And I want us to be actually much more ambitious than we have been in the last year or 18 months in terms of what we seek to achieve in those agreements. The second thing is the market access barriers. That sits with me, right? But it doesn't sit with me. It belongs to every single minister in the DIT, it belongs to the Prime Minister, it belongs to the Chancellor, it belongs to every minister in the business department, every minister in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. One of the things I did when I was last in this role was to create a dashboard of market access asks for every country in the world. And that should be the day-to-day terms of trade in everything the government is doing, in every ambassadorial engagement, in every bilateral ministerial engagement, in every single conversation. We should be using our trade envoys, people like Shanker, who is, by the way, an absolutely brilliant advisor to us, to the department and to me. I often ask Shanker, what is it in a trade negotiation that the department don't want me to know? And he tells me very clearly what it is, and I then deploy his advice in asking the team for that. And then the third element is the exploitation of the opportunities that the removal of market access barriers and the free trade agreements create. And that is going to be Kemi's focus, by the way. She is absolutely determined to be an export champion, to deliver on the government's ambition, to create growth, to create wealth, to create opportunity. And any of you who heard her yesterday, I mean, she is a brilliant communicator. She explained how trade is a moral pursuit, that trade creates wealth, and wealth creates worth, and that if we want to advance the international rules-based order, if we want to export our values of freedom under a rule of law, free speech, and so on, the underpinning of that has always been the emergence of a middle class. In dictatorships around the world, the biggest thing they fear is the emergence of a middle class. And trade creates that opportunity. Trade is a means by which we can export our values and our beliefs to the wider world, to give citizens internationally the aspiration to have our standard of living, quality of life, and rules-based order. So I'm hugely excited by the opportunities that we have. We've got an ambitious program. We've got the India deal. The Prime Minister wants that signed by Diwali. That's an ambitious target. We've got the CPTPP accession, which we want to do this year. We're engaged in a huge number of bilateral trade conversations with countries around the world. Next week I will be in Peru, in Chile and Uruguay. We're prioritizing the Gulf Cooperation Council area as a trade ambition early next year. We've got a huge amount to do, and it is terribly exciting. And having spent, I have to say, my friends, the last year in Northern Ireland as Minister of State, it is a delight to be back in international trade.
Connor, thank you very much indeed. I'm going to kick off with a couple of questions for our panellists. Thanks to all of you for your analysis and thoughts, and then I'm going to come to the floor. So when I'm looking up, catch my eye if you want to ask a question. The first question I wanted to ask, and Connor, I'll start with you and then go along the panel, is you might argue that the UK government's approach to trade post-Brexit has been largely based on the trade deal concept, and I welcome that. Trade deals can facilitate trade, as you say. It's a question of making them work. They're not just ticking them off. But what are your thoughts, and then I'll ask the other panellists, on whether there's more unilateral action the UK can take? So I'm all for the trade deals, getting the multilateral stuff working again, and sometimes 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But unilateral action is wholly in our hands, in your department's hands. Do you think that's been deployed as a trade strategy in recent years? And what's the present thinking in the department and in the government of what the UK can do without the need to actually meet trade partners, just do it ourselves in terms of relaxing tariffs or mutual recognition or unilateral recognition of different regulations and jurisdictions, for example? I welcome your thoughts there, and then I'll go through the other panels.
So look, Mark, you're absolutely right. So look, I was asked this question, a variation of this question yesterday at one of your competitors, the CPS.
We're free market. We welcome
Yeah,
competition.
good, exactly. And I was asked, did I still believe in Brexit? And I said, absolutely, I believed in Brexit. Brexit is not a sort of, religious creed or ideological thing. It is about the ability to make our own decisions in the United Kingdom, in the interests of the United Kingdom, to deliver prosperity for our citizens. And I apologized, actually, on behalf of the government, for our abject failure to actually take advantage of the benefits that Brexit gave us. Now, we can use excuses about pandemic and all the rest of it. We voted to leave. The government accepted that. One of the reasons I so admired and so enjoyed working with Liz when she was International Trade Secretary, she'd been a Remainer. She understood immediately the opportunities that presented themselves for the United Kingdom having her own independent trade policy for the first time in 50 years. Our lead negotiator is from New Zealand, right? We imported him. We had nobody who was working in the civil service who had been in the civil service the last time the United Kingdom had her own independent trade policy. And you are absolutely right, Mark, to identify that FTAs are a great thing. Who's our largest bilateral trading partner? It's the United States. We don't have an FTA with the United States, but they're our largest partner. We're unlikely, let's be candid, to have a new free trade agreement with the United States in the medium term. I'm very conscious Emilio's back there, so I'm going to be very cautious in what I say because he's tweeting. But there's a huge amount we can do at a state level in terms of mutual recognition of professional qualifications, of digital trade corridors. There's a huge amount you can do without trade agreements. And one of the things that I want to prioritize, again, I sort of said this a second ago, is the market access barriers. So I created a dashboard when I was last in this post. I wanted to know what were the top 5 asks of every single country in the world. We did this, by the way, with some of the Gulf countries in terms of physical signatures on documents accompanying goods. We did it with Bahrain, with Saudi, with Kuwait, I think with Qatar, and I think Algeria. Shanker might correct me on that. And we got them to move to digital, accept the acceptance of digital signatures. What I want us to do now, and I said this to the officials last week, I want not just the dashboard, I want the splashboard. I want monthly for us to be pointing out how we are removing market access barriers, how we are freeing up the arteries of international trade and make companies aware. One final point in this. When I was last in post, we reckoned that less than 11% of UK companies exported anything beyond the UK's internal market. And we reckoned that about 2/3 of those companies were accidental exporters. In other words, they had a website, somebody Googled something, they happened upon the website, they placed an order, the order was fulfilled, and they were suddenly an export.
So only about 4% of companies deliberate exporters.
Correct.
Yeah.
They had no export strategy. We got to fix that. We have really got to fix that. And I just wish in the UK that we could see ourselves in the way that we are seen internationally. That Brexit is a huge opportunity. Countries around the world are asking the question, how does Brexit mean we can do more with Britain?
Great. Anishka, what are your thoughts on unilateral action that can be taken? I say the debate's often framed and these other areas are important, but is there anything the UK government can do that doesn't require reference to another jurisdiction?
One thing it can do in terms of its own market, and this is a little bit tangential, but if I take duty-free, is actually the biggest market for Scotch whisky in the world, bigger than America. So the UK introduced a 4-litre allowance post-Brexit, but you can only buy those 4 litres if you're in Copenhagen or you're leaving from America or somewhere else. You cannot purchase 4 litres on arrival in the UK, but you can in over 60 other markets worldwide. So that is one thing the UK could do to ease the domestic market here and allow what is the biggest shop front, if you like, for Scotch whisky in the world. And it's the way some of our biggest brands have been bought. And the times that, and built, India was very protectionist. You could see that Royal Salute and other brands established themselves there before they came into the domestic market.
Sally, what are your thoughts on what unilateral action the UK government could take whilst still pursuing trade deals and the rest?
Well, look, if I ruled the world, there are 3 things I would do with the British government, none of which need anybody else's involvement. So the first is that I would shake up our export finance a little bit. I think that instead of taking a somewhat scattergun approach, I would put some big bets on some sectors where we're already market leading. To really boost exports there, I would pick high-end food and drink, not just because I'm on a Pernod panel, but because it's a really good place to look. Pharmaceuticals, green tech, green services, fintech, professional services, really get those moving with export finance. I would revamp the gov.uk website, which is awful relative to our competitors and makes it almost impossible for someone who wants to export to find all the information in one place. And I would smarten up the UK missions and really jolt them into representing our British businesses overseas in a much, much more positive way than they currently do. I've had conversations with clients overseas who are saying that they are man-marked by our competitors, whereas our missions hosted a drink receptions a couple of years ago and they haven't heard from them since. We could be much better. And if we did those 3 things, I think we could move the dial, and there's low cost, high ambition.
Shanker, you've always explained what our overall trade strategy would be through a number of pillars, bilateral, multilateral, plurilateral, and this unilateral pillar. I just wanted your thoughts on what you'd like to see Conor and the government doing unilaterally.
Well, just a few high-level thoughts. So, what is trade? Trade is just voluntary exchange across borders. Now, the problem is that when you are doing it across a border, you don't control the other government. So they can do things that will make it difficult for you to get market access. So why do we do trade deals? The most optimal thing would be if every country removed all its tariffs and removed all its regulatory barriers and all its protection and so on. Now, that will not happen because there are real powerful interests at stake here and that's the reason the barriers exist. So you do a trade deal in order to lower the barriers in the other country. Now, in order to do that, you do need something to trade with, because unfortunately we don't, not all of us embrace free trade, and therefore sometimes trade negotiations can become a bit mercantilist. So you do need a little bit of that. Now, having said that, there are some unilateral things that you can do. So, for example, you can lower your tariffs for products that you don't produce or products that are not directly competitive with things that you do produce. You can do that right off the bat. And you can do a lot of regulatory things to improve your own domestic regulatory position, removing the barriers internally. And I would recommend, that we are doing that. So the difficulty is, from sort of Connor's department standpoint, is that a lot of the things that prevent them getting the trade deals that are actually meaningful, that actually lower these things, are things that we do ourselves, right? So they're baggage that we carry ourselves, and it's not the Department of International Trade that can solve them. It's DEFRA, or it's BEIS, or it's somebody else. And so therefore you have to be able to work that trade policy and explain the benefits to those departments so they can change their regulatory system.
I'm going to ask one more question, very quick answers from the panel, if you don't mind, even though it's a rather complex question, which is, how concerned should we be on UK-EU trade relations with the Northern Ireland Protocol in your previous role, Connor? And I know an issue that the government's attempting to resolve, but we've talked about the uncertainty and the turbulence in global markets. Is this going to be a real tension between UK and EU, Anishka? Solve that for me in a couple of sentences.
Well, as a French company domiciled, I think we're a very good example of the confidence that investors are still showing in the UK market, and we are working with governments on both sides to encourage resolution of the outstanding issues, and we are confident that they will get there.
Connor.
Okay, so there's two ways of, getting something not reported. One is to speak at a fringe, and one is to make a speech in Parliament. I want to tell you really quickly what I spent the summer doing. I said to both Liz and Rishi right at the beginning of the leadership election that I didn't really want to get involved too deeply in the leadership election. Some of you may know, was quite heavily involved in the previous leadership election. I was with Boris when we were not exactly overburdened with support, when he resigned as Foreign Secretary. And I said to both of them what I would love to do when I was in Northern Ireland was to try and see if there was an opportunity to create space on the protocol. And I had a huge number of meetings with the Irish government, with the Dáil Foreign Affairs Committee, with the Taoiseach, with former Taoiseach Bertie Ahern. Tony Blair was incredibly helpful. I met him for an hour at his office, and he engaged with the Commission, and I met with Vice President Jelicich. And Shanker, by the way, was hugely helpful in advising me on a huge amount of this as well over the course of the summer. And we got to the point, literally on the eve of the announcement of the leadership result on the Sunday evening. I had been to the British-Irish Association meeting in Oxford, where I had two sustained long bilats with Vice President Jelicich. And we were able to show the Commission the following week that we had resolved the issue of data sharing, that we could share real time what was leaving ports in Scotland, Wales, England, heading to Northern Ireland. They looked at that, they agreed that we had solved data sharing, and today we've had the, I think, really good news that we are starting again talks on the protocol. It is absolutely in the United Kingdom's interest, the Republic of Ireland's interest, and the European Union's interest that we resolve this in a negotiated way, recognizing the unique challenge of having an island with two jurisdictions, one in the EU and one not. And I said to Liz, when it was clear she was going to win, I want to try and help you have space and options that are beyond the Northern Ireland Protocol bill. I think with goodwill, with a degree of pragmatism, we can make the protocol work. Jelicich was very clear that if we solve data sharing, the border becomes pretty much invisible. That they would only have to check things where there was an intelligence, evidence-based concern that they needed to look at it. The DUP want this, I think, as well. If we can unlock this, if we can agree something pragmatic that works, that puts on parity, and this is key, puts on parity the integrity of the United Kingdom's internal market with the European Union's single market. We can restore devolved government in Northern Ireland, and this is the key, this is the prize, right? This is the prize. We can actually move to a new post-Brexit mature relationship with the European Union where they accept that we are not going back in. Brexit is done. We are a partner and a friend and a neighbour and an ally, and we can move on and we can recalibrate the relationship with the Republic of Ireland. I think it is a huge, huge opportunity that has been unlocked today.
We're a bit up against the clock. I do want to bring in so Shanker and Sally. You might want to come back on the Northern Ireland point in the answers of the question. I see the gentleman here. You've got the microphone. If you introduce yourself, sir. I'm going to take, I think, 3 at a time. So, and here's second, and then the gentleman in the with the handkerchief in his very elegant handkerchief in his top pocket at the back. If we take those 3, introduce yourself, keep it sharp, short and sweet, and then I'll come back to the panel, sir.
Thanks, Mark. Hal Thompson, Chairman of the Conservative Policy Forum in Surrey Heath. The penny finally seems to have dropped. The cost of energy in the UK is really, really important, not just in the short term, but in the longer term as well. Putting climate change aside, it really matters to everywhere else on the planet that we find solutions to energy that is independent of fossil fuel, but is also affordable. What are we doing in terms of research and development in the UK to support people who understand the subject and have potential solutions in the long term? And I'm thinking particularly of molten salt nuclear reactors as a matter of aside.
And here.
Thanks. Michael Bracken from Beaconsfield. Are we prepared to take on the dark forces of UK protectionism? The Australia deal had a 15-year transition on some products. I guess another short version of my question is, when will I be given the choice to buy US chicken?
Great question. And sir.
Marco Forgione from the Institute of Export and International Trade. Just to reinforce Sally's point, we are the largest provider of training and qualifications in international trade in the UK, and salaries in the industry over the past 2 years have gone up over 40%. So if you've got talent in the organisation, cling on to it. If you haven't, come to us. Now, the biggest point for me is to echo Shanker. As he knows, we are working on digital trade corridors, trying to encourage and facilitate that trade. But the biggest challenge, in order to get the small and medium-sized enterprises trading internationally, and they're declining, is getting government departments to collaborate and understand that trade and international trade has to be the core, not just of overseas and policy and international policy, but domestic policy as well.
So a few things to get your teeth into. Shanker, I'll start with you. The energy question, the forces of UK protectionism. When can I have my chlorinated chicken sandwich rather than my coronation chicken sandwich? And do we need to widen trade out from just Connor's department for it to actually go through all of the departments of government? Shanker.
Yeah, nice easy questions. So just on the Northern Ireland thing, I mean, the problem with the protocol issue is it is the gate through which our relationship with the EU goes, and we need to move on to some of the second generation things you do in a trade agreement, which we have with the EU. We are in a good position because there's not many major players that have, the US does not have a trade deal with the EU, we do. So we need to make it more deeper, we need to do more mutual recognition, we need to do a lot of things. None of that will happen until we solve the protocol. On energy production, lowering the cost of energy in the UK and actually around the world is really critical. There are a lot of regulatory distortions in the energy market. Some of it relates to how we privatised in the first place. Some of it is just various things that come out of legislation that actually goes back about more than 15 years. So there's a lot embedded there. That's the first step. And then you have to maximise production because we don't have enough. And you're right, it does apply. There are other concerns. If the US, for example, had been producing more energy, we would have been able to have an alternative for the Germans in terms of Russian gas with respect to Ukraine. We didn't have that, and therefore we are going to have a tough time in the winter holding European unity together on energy with regard to Ukraine. Protectionism in the UK, this is not new. Protectionism is a powerful force because very powerful people benefit from it. So one of the things I would recommend is the Trade Remedy Authority, which is the body that does trade defence in the UK, the tariffs for anti-dumping and countervailing duties and so on. This is where somebody who wants a tariff goes. I would recommend that body does not have, and I'm not sure how Connor will feel about this, but I would recommend that body does not have there is not ministerial discretion over it, because the problem with discretion is that it becomes very political. And in that field, in that political field, the consumer-friendly position will always lose to the producer position because of the power of the different forces. When can you have your chicken? And I have to state that I am a member of the Trade and Agriculture Commission, so we do see these issues on a pretty regular basis. I think the UK should comply with the WTO's SPS agreement, and I think we should be building on the WTO's SPS agreement in our trade agreements with countries. We should be WTO plus, more based on sound science, more based on objective equivalence determinations based on regulatory systems. So that's about as far as I can go on that one. And then Marco's question on digital trade corridors, and this is really important stuff. This is the customs facilitation piece of the equation, and it's really important we do what we can here. We have an opportunity with the MOUs with the US states to do some of this. We have opportunities to do them in trade agreements. Every single trade agreement has a customs and trade facilitation chapter that make big commitments to digitization of trade, to single trade window, to all of these things. We need to get serious about that. And the digitization of trade is very much in multiple government departments. It's in HMRC, it's in Cabinet Office, DEFRA has something to say about it, BEIS has something to say about it. So running trade policy through all government departments is really important, and I think we've done. The UK has done a pretty good job actually of doing that. We could do a lot better, but it is relatively new thing. So, but it does need to be emphasised.
Thank you, Sally.
I just want to pick up on UK protectionism, because I am all for removing protectionist barriers, but let's do it judicially. And I'm going to give you 2 real-life examples to give you some contrast. So, first one is nematode worms, which I'm sure isn't what you came here expecting. One of the companies I work with exported nematode worms to the EU prior to Brexit because they're a green alternative to chemical fertilisers. Now, the trouble that they have, and the reason they can't export now, is because each box of nematode worms, and a box that big contains about 500,000, the EU says that every single one of those nematode worms needs its own vet certification. Now, no vet can certify 500,000 worms. No vet would recognise a diseased nematode worm if he or she came across it. That's clearly crazy. That's the kind of protectionism we should get rid of. On the other hand, I found myself a couple of years ago reading the Detergents Directive, 40 blockbusting pages, not for fun, I'm not that sad, but the reason I read it was because a client had asked me to analyse it, and actually, although it is 40 pages, all it says is entirely sensible. It says, if you make a product that people put on their skin or hair, make sure it doesn't give them chemical burns. If you mix 2 things together, make sure the combination doesn't give them chemical burns. If you add coagulants or perfumes to make it smell or feel nicer, make sure that doesn't give them chemical burns. And if you do give them chemical burns, make sure you're maintaining a register so we can make sure it doesn't happen again. Now, there is nothing in any of that I have a massive issue with, because I don't want chemical burns. So let's by all means look at protectionist measures. Let's by all means look at the regulation. But let's do it calmly, judiciously, sensibly, work out what we need and is actually a sensible measure to maintain and what we don't need. Let's not just burn the regulations willy-nilly.
Thank you. Anishka.
Thanks. You mentioned the dark forces of protectionism. I think that the best antidote to darkness is sunlight and transparency. We need open consultation processes that involve stakeholders. We need clear evidence as to who benefits and who loses. We need proportionate responses, and we need arm's length and objective institutions to assess it. And further to the point about the 40%, I hope my trade team do not hear that.
And Connor, the last word is yours.
So I see my good friend Niall Gardner has come in, who worked brilliantly for Lady Thatcher. I always remember Lady Thatcher speaking at a conference fringe, and she said, "I'm told I have to be very careful what I say, and I don't like it at all." And I'm finding that big back in trade. There's some things I'd like to say that I probably shouldn't say, and I'm going to say one of them. And that is that DEFRA needs to be more than the London office of the National Farmers Union. And we need to understand the opportunities that exist for the UK agri-sector. Our produce is deemed a premium produce internationally. There is huge export opportunity for the United Kingdom, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland agri-sector. Trade deals do not need to be seen through the prism of threat. They can be seen through the prism of opportunity. And I am hoping that Liz's decision to promote Ranil, who was a junior minister under her in international trade, to DEFRA, will recalibrate, will reset our interaction in terms of the framing of international free trade agreements. Just sort of final point on just common sense on borders and the EU. You know, and Jelicich, by the way, got this big time. You know, there is no threat from seed potatoes moving from Scotland to Northern Ireland. They've done so for generations. There is no threat to the European single market for oak tree saplings being planted in Northern Ireland for the Jubilee. What do we think they're going to do? Are they going to sort of rise up and sort of march Triffid-like on Dublin? You know, proportion and sense needs to be applied to our borders, and I'm optimistic we'll do it.
Well, on that proportionate and sensible note, please join me in thanking Sally, Connor, Anishka and Shanker, our excellent panel, and in particular Pernod for the generous sponsorship. Thank you all. A number of you might be wanting to attend the next event, but I've been told for security reasons we've got to clear the entire room before the In Conversation with Lord Frost. If you wish to attend that, please leave through the doors and a new queue will form on the left-hand side as you exit if you want to come.